All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Tuesday, October 7th. Our schedule this week is a bit hectic, so we're not doing the regular Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but by next week, I think we'll be hopefully back to normal. Um, anyways, maybe you can catch me up with just major events over the past 3 or 4 days.
Okay, yeah, there are many of them. I think the most important is the ceasefire, so called, in Palestine, in Gaza. If you remember, it was the 20-point plan that Trump put forward as his own. It really was something that the Arab states, the Gulf states in particular, had. But, actually, I think Egypt and Turkey also had input in this, something that they had put forward. They had put something, presented or proposed something similar, like better than a year ago, but it just never got anywhere. But this time, Trump made it his own. He pushed it. Then it got watered down somewhat. I think the Israelis made some changes. And now we have this 20-point plan that Hamas agreed to, sort of, and the Israelis agreed to, sort of. And immediately after we got agreements from both sides, Trump declared, back this past weekend or, just a few days ago that great, Hamas has agreed to this. Now, apparently that was a surprise to Netanyahu, who thought that, they were going to use the Hamas response as an excuse, or, they would interpret it as a rejection and say, again, once again, Hamas, is refusing an opportunity for peace. They're the obstacle to peace, and we must continue with our offensive in Gaza City. But that's not what Trump did. He actually immediately said, great, Hamas has agreed to this. And now, Israel, you stop bombing. Israel didn't stop bombing. There continued to be, a high level of casualties in Gaza City and elsewhere over the next couple of days. But the last report I saw, it showed that though the attack hadn't stopped entirely, it had significantly declined. So maybe the Israelis are starting to accept the first step, which is a ceasefire. Now, this is supposed to be followed by a prisoner exchange. Nearly 2,000 prisoners, on the Israeli side will be released to Hamas, or we're not sure, will be released. Where to, it's not entirely clear. The West Bank, overseas, into Gaza, that hardly sounds like an improvement. I think I don't know where I would rather want to be, in an Israeli prison or in Gaza at this point, or even the West Bank. The West Bank is kind of turning into a prison itself. But anyway, that is likely to take place. And then on the Hamas side, they are supposed to release all of the remaining hostages, so-called, prisoners, both living and dead. And that's just supposed to be, the first of many steps. Eventually, the Israelis are supposed to pull out. This international peacekeeping force is supposed to come in. There's supposed to be this new kind of, at least a temporary government overseen by Tony Blair, of all people. And then Trump, symbolically at the top of that. There will be something called the Peace Board. But then eventually to some sort of, maybe handover to probably to the Palestinian Authority. Again, a lot of this hasn't been spelled out in detail, so a lot of things can go wrong. That's something that we've talked about earlier. We mentioned the ceasefire that we had at the beginning of the year that was actually agreed to prior to Trump's inauguration, and it seemed like a great start. But then, so the first phase, once it was completed, and by the way, the Israelis didn't really abide by their side of it, and they continued to kill Gazans, so in smaller numbers, and they failed to provide a lot of the services and goods that they were supposed to, allow into Gaza. They failed to do that. So, there were many breaches, but it still more or less the ceasefire held up until the end of the first phase, and then the Israelis just broke it, and with the support of Trump. So we just have to ask ourselves: is that what's going to happen again? And I think it's certainly a possibility. I think it's more than that; it's a probability, but it's not certain. And there are some differences this time. And I would say one is the increasingly weak position or precarious position of Netanyahu, that he is very unpopular within his own country. There is a lot of growing anger towards him. They know that he's been playing this game, that he's been doing everything to avoid any kind of ceasefire. And then finally Trump, really imposed it on him. And puts him, in a difficult position. He's got, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and the other, we always mention those two, but there are many, extremists on one side that are part of his coalition. But then he has, the international community, he has the domestic opposition. He has Trump, and he apparently, anyway, Trump, who knows, but, apparently at this point, and the Gulf states. And that's a difference from the last time, is that it seems that Trump is actually responding to the Gulf states. And he does, see them, I think his relationship with them is important. Now, apparently, it was sacrificed to Israel during that attack, against the Hamas negotiating team just a few weeks ago. But, let's not forget that altogether about $1 trillion that have been promised to the Trump administration or to the U.S. government by these Gulf states. This is something I think that is important to Trump. His relationship, it does matter. And they to a great extent made this happen. What I've heard is that they put a lot of pressure on Hamas to agree to this, to go ahead with this. Hamas is resistant for obvious reasons. We give up the hostages, then that's the last we have, and they're just going to kill us, and there's nothing stopping them. That's their fear, and it's a very legitimate fear. But the Gulf states apparently, and other Muslim states put a huge amount of pressure on them, and Hamas did agree to begin this process. So the big question is, will Trump stick to it? It is the Trump plan. That's what he's calling it. He has something invested in it. He has the support. He knows that he has the support of the Gulf states. He knows he has the support of much of the Israeli population. And he also has the support of some of his mega donors, like Miriam Adelson, again, a real fervent Zionist, but also somebody who wants to see the hostages brought home. So at least for the first part of it anyway, he's got the support of her. So, we'll see. Will he stick with this? He's the one person that could make Netanyahu, fall through with this. And Trump? He does have cards. Trump is. Yeah, Trump is the person that could do it. And he does have cards to play. There is a strong domestic opposition. There are the Gulf states, and so there are real powers arrayed against Netanyahu. One thing is this wouldn't, and there are a lot of people within the U.S. too. With like in the Democratic Party that would just like to see Netanyahu go. It's not that they have, within the establishment. Okay, they're still Zionists through and through, but they understand that Netanyahu has become a real liability, and they would like to see him go. Again, the most prominent example of one of the Zionists is Chuck Schumer. He's kind of like Mr. Zionist himself, but it was about 2 years ago that he actually, I guess it wasn't 2 years ago, like a year ago, that he gave a speech saying that Netanyahu has to go. So anyway, there are forces arrayed against him, and so, but we'll see. Within one big question is like once those hostages are come home, that has been the rallying cry for the opposition to Netanyahu in Israel, and now maybe. Okay, it's done. And so maybe the pressure will be off him because, again, as we've mentioned before, when you look at the polls, they don't care. Unfortunately, Jewish Israelis, better than 80% say, yeah, ethnically cleanse Gaza, and something like better than 50% even go so far as at least to imply, yeah, kill them all. So he may find it easy at that point, after this first phase is completed, to go ahead. Because he has an extreme pressure, not only does he have, the resistance to him isn't about the genocide in Israel. Unfortunately, that's the case. It's about the hostages. So once that problem is solved, maybe he can get back to it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's actually what I was thinking. I was bringing up. I was like, well, I don't think that this process is going to go the whole way, and it never does. And so we should be looking at what is the opportune moment for Netanyahu to break the deal. And it feels to me it's like once you get the hostages back, then he'll have free range to continue with his genocide. Right now, he's pacified his opposition within Israel. They're all about the hostages. Like you're saying, it's not about the genocide. It's about the Israeli hostages. Then that's done. It's almost, that's a roadblock removed from him, right?
Yeah.
So
right.
And then the other option I think he has is, well, if he really is in trouble, Netanyahu's going to do what's good for Netanyahu, not necessarily for Israel. And that means, wartime powers. That's another theory that's being flown around there, is that maybe that Netanyahu's like, okay, we'll do this peace deal and this plan, but it's just an opportunity for them to pivot to Iran. Do you think there's much credence to that theory?
Well, there's always that possibility. I just want to add one other thing. Is like, within Israel, to the right of Netanyahu, and I think this is true of Netanyahu himself. So the Likud party and the parties to the right of the Likud, they are, they feel like they have been promised actually at least a big piece of Gaza, like North Gaza, for settlement. That at least, this is what they're expecting. They're actually, open public discussions about, how we're going to settle, what we're going to do with this land. So they're going to feel betrayed. And, again, these people are powerful and they're violent. They're not just fringe parties anymore. This is, so anyway, there's going to be tremendous, I've talked about the pressures arrayed against them, at least up until the hostage release. But then there's some powerful countervailing, pressures on the other side, especially once those hostages are released. And then there's the question, but if I think this has always been true, that he's looked at foreign adventures as a way to distract from his own, personal problems, both his legal problems and political problems. So there's always that chance. I would say, though, that, again, we're not seeing a buildup. This is my position. And I know I'm kind of in a minority on this, that we're not seeing a buildup to war against Iran. A lot of people are saying it's imminent, and they just might be right. They just may come out, but it'll be very much unlike the last one when there was a clear buildup. I'm just not seeing it. We had that report of the tankers and other aircraft being moved to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. But even then, the two of us commented on the fact that actually that's not where they should be if you're getting ready to attack Iran, because that's a very vulnerable airbase. Like the last time I remember, they were being sent to all the way to Diego Garcia, out of range of the Iranian, missiles. And then I saw a report. It's only from one source, from Rebar, who has the Russian who has a Telegram channel. And he said that actually these tankers were part of some rotation, and then other tankers were sent back to Europe. I don't know. I haven't heard that confirmed. So anyway, I'm very skeptical about that. But it's true. I mean, he always, I think, clearly to Netanyahu. Okay, there's two levels. He's not just. It's not just about Netanyahu and his political survival, or for him, it's all the same thing. It's Netanyahu himself and the greater vision. He wants his legacy. He wants to be the man who defeated Iran. I think that's part of who he wants to be. And so he looks at Iran and he sees unfinished business. And so there is always, and then he also has his personal troubles. So there's always that motivation, and it could happen. Yeah, there's no question at any time. I'm just not seeing any indication of it right now.
Yeah, I was thinking about that just a couple of days ago as well, that I also just felt like war with Iran was imminent. And you're saying, well, you don't see the groundwork being laid for the public opinion. I was thinking, well, maybe there might be a problem with us in the dissident media, that we're kind of reinforcing each other's,
I think
biases.
It definitely happens. It definitely happens.
Right.
So we got to be careful about that.
Right. But somebody says it that, we respect all these guys and they're all these great analysts, but then, you become in this little loop. And I was thinking maybe that's the problem. We're just kind of reinforcing it. A lot of people are, I think, kind of are almost hoping for it, because it just seems like it's not a question of if, it's when, and people just want to get it over with. But the only theory that I have that I think that could lead to an imminent strike is I do think that there's this possibility of a false flag that has to be laid. And then that would be good. You don't show any sign beforehand for the false flag, because that would tell people that you're doing a false flag. So you're not moving necessarily your troops in position. You're not trying to warm up public opinion. You wait for some incident, and then it just rapid fire. Boom, 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 boom. Oh my God, it was Iran. Here's this fake news, confusion. Oh my goodness, let's go to war. Go, 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 go. And I think that's possible. I don't know if do you know this influencer Laura Loomer, one of the hardcore.
Yeah, I do. I know about it.
It's almost impressive just how she just is just so openly, just like a Mossad agent, essentially. Just everything she does is framed in the framework of Zionism. But she's been putting out some tweets recently that just makes me worried. Just saying like, oh, I've got insider knowledge of a false flag. There's something big coming, and it's just like, well, if it's coming from you, Laura, then everybody know. So but who knows? Maybe they don't have that. That's I think a big problem Israel has now, is that they can't get anybody to organically support Israel anymore. So when people are supporting Israel, it just becomes so obvious, like who's
paying you?
Who's paying you, right? Just the fact that news story came out that Israel is paying $7,000 per post. This should have everybody up in arms. Just think about how we were just so upset about Russiagate, which turned out to be a big nothing burger, like all this influence. Right. Here's a foreign government, and we just dismiss it. It's because it's Israel, and they're engaged in a genocide, and they're paying $7,000 because people won't organically support a genocide. They have to pay somebody $7,000 to say maybe it's okay to kill these kids. Yeah. It's just it's crazy.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Russia does nothing, and they have to suffer, this abuse for years and years. And then Israel now is actually buying up our major media companies. Like Larry Ellison is basically a representative of Israel. He, the number one donor to the IDF, on the IDF board and everything. Buying up CBS, TikTok, and
CBS, Paramount with Barry Weiss. Just the whole thing. Yeah, it's so crazy.
It's just so open, and there's just basically a shrug of the shoulders from the New York Times and all these places. All these media outlets that played up the Russia hoax for years and years and years. It's just like, that's the way things are.
Yeah. Well, it's the I guess the positive thing is that I think there's no putting that genie back in the bottle. Everybody is aware now of this undue special relationship that we have with Israel, and Israel buying off our influencers. Just that video of Netanyahu just openly talking about, what are the problems with the Eighth Front? We got to buy TikTok. And then what's the other one, class? X. Yeah.
Right.
Hey, Elon Musk's a friend. We'll talk to him. It's like, you're just openly saying we got to censor. The gall of that man to just talk like that, knowing that he's being recorded. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Right. Well, they just have this sense of impunity, and that sense of impunity is well founded, because they just gotten away with literal murder for years and decades. And so, but I think it may be that we are starting to, actually cross a threshold here. I think you're right. It's just that, he could get away with it in the past. And, to some extent he will, like I was saying, the mainstream media is not going to say anything, and they haven't said anything about this, but it's a new media landscape, and it's a new era. People are just much less favorable towards Israel and much more skeptical in general of mainstream news sources.
I think a lot of people are expecting that the war with Iran, it will happen at some point. You still hold that position that it will happen, but you just don't think that it will happen.
Yeah, probably. It's not completely clear to me that it even will happen. It took a long time for it to happen. There's talk about it for 20 years before we had this strike. And I think a lot of it happened at that time because of just a conjunction of forces. And, part of it was this Operation Rising Lion. And that's something that I don't think they can ever do again. And so then we have this whole question, there are these hard constraints, the air defense on the side of Israel, and then air defense in Iran. Both of them, I'm sure, are racing. And both of them are making, or especially, it's not, I don't think there's virtually no chance for Iran to attack Israel. I think they could justify such an attack. But it's almost certainly going to be Israel that's going to attack Iran again. So Iran is looking, I'm sure, is looking at all these things and trying to, strengthen their position for another round as soon as possible. But Iran is not staying, so Israel is rushing to, again, for the next round. But Iran is not staying still. And the thing is, if Iran can actually, strengthen its defenses and its offense, the offense is in a way that it's defense because that's deterrence. And if it can do that quickly enough, it may be that Israel will just find that window of opportunity just is slammed shut. And then again, they're just dependent on the U.S. And the U.S. so far, has shown no interest, again, in going in. And I think Trump wants it to end where it did. It just seems like that was it. He did the most incredible bombing mission in the history of the world and obliterated Iran's nuclear program, and they're never coming back. And that's the way he liked to keep it. But, of course, you just never can rely on Trump. And at some point he may say, did I ever say that? Come out, so we'll see. Again, clearly Israel will have to get the U.S. in on their side. But it's difficult, because again, the U.S. is reluctant. They have shown reluctance, even in spite of being such, firm supporters of Israel. They've understood that there are real risks to the U.S. in a war against Iran. And that's why it didn't happen for such a long time. And then when it did happen, the U.S. became involved. They made it really quick. And then, the war stopped shortly thereafter. So it's not a certain thing that Netanyahu can convince the U.S. to come in on his side.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking about that as well. There's, like you said, there's the hard constraints, but it's just the idea of us going to war with Iran. Everybody is going to know in America that we're doing this for Israel. I just don't think, even with the false flag, I don't think it's going to succeed. It's just, it is hard to see. And I think part of me wants it to happen. And I know, and that's I shouldn't think that way. That shouldn't be a position I take. And I was thinking about it as well. I think the better option, actually, unfortunately, this isn't going to save the Palestinians, but I don't think Iran striking Israel is going to save the Palestinians either. People want to see that happen because it's almost cathartic, therapeutic, just to think like finally they get a taste of their own medicine. You've been laughing about killing children for so long. It just, people want to see Iran hit them hard. But when that happens, then all hell breaks loose. Then we got all, if there is blackmail on the Epstein, I'm sure that's going to be being used, whatever it is. This is it. Battle for Western civilization, they're going to frame it as. And, there's the Samson option. It's terrifying. And I just almost feel like maybe it's not as satisfying for people, but the best option might be is that this Iran war never happens and Israel just slowly bleeds out. They are, they are a pariah state. Nobody, they are done for. The damage done from this genocide, I think, is fatal in the long term. From this, they have lost all future Zionist support from the United States, and that in itself means it's over. Just that fact, and then you have the rest of the world hates them, and this sentiment is going to it's going to be mainstream globally. And then that means Israel can't exist. And so maybe it's better if you don't hit them with missiles. They are just shunned socially, globally. And that in itself will just kill the state. Their economy crumbles. People are going to be like, you know what? I'm not proud to be Israeli anymore. Maybe I should go back to Poland, change my citizenship, and drop that identity.
Yeah, well, certainly. I think it is true. Again, they have wounded themselves, harmed themselves irreparably. They really are not coming back from this. They still have the firm support of the U.S. establishment, of the Western establishment in general. But as we see, that support is not going to last forever. There have been dramatic shifts in public opinion, and eventually that becomes reflected in the makeup of the establishment. It may be years, it may even be decades. I hate to say that, but it may even be. But I hope not. I hope it's just we're talking about some years and not too many years. But that will go, and then Israel, without that support, can no longer pursue the Zionist project. It's really over. So that's true. And then again, I think I actually, just like other people, there is part of me that wants Iran to strike Israel and to, again, to give them a taste of their own medicine. But there is that Samson option. And again, Iran too will suffer. It's just like we're here, we're not paying the consequences of any of this. It could be that, but when it's your own family that might be wiped out or whatever, it's just wrong for people on the outside to, to push for war.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I just, war. I hope we don't go. I hope it doesn't happen because if it does, I just think that's when all hell breaks loose. And how long do you think it would take for Israel to, if we just kind of stop? I think the problem is now people want justice, and I don't know how we're going to satisfy that for the world for what's been done to Palestine. There's just going to be that hatred, that lingering. Do we need justice, or is trying to pursue justice maybe too dangerous? Or should you?
Well,
you know what I mean? It's like
no, I know that's true. I mean, you just you have to be a realist, and sometimes we all want justice, and justice is proper. We should have it, but we don't know. It's not always possible. Politics is always the art of the possible, and what we can.
Justice
in the meantime, it's just like
justice will be dealt by just the people, not necessarily in the court, but just the court of public opinion in that sense. That if you are an IDF member, that's the modern day Nazi symbol. If you were engaged in this, if you were supporting this, that's what it means. We don't have to necessarily put everybody in front of a tribunal. That's not. I don't know if that's possible. And maybe the worst perpetrators. Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich. Maybe we can see at some. Even then, I don't know if it's ever going to happen. I don't think it's. Yeah, it's something I struggle with. You want justice, but it's just like I don't want the world to blow up either.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No. If you could get some kind of deal, where actually like. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and Netanyahu, they go, I don't know where they would go to, but, they go to a well-guarded island somewhere in the Indian Ocean. And even though they're going to be comfortable, but if that was the end of the Zionist project, I say, okay, I don't care. In the end, the more important thing is for the Zionist project to end and for, Palestinians to live in peace and to live, just for the genocide to end.
We need Elon to send him to Mars. I don't want him on this planet.
Okay.
It's just, it's too scary, too dangerous. Okay. Well, is there anything else that we want to talk about regarding the Middle East right now? Anything at big events? I mean, it's the October 7th holiday. Oh my God, I almost said holiday. The October 7th, two-year anniversary since October 7th.
Right. 2 years.
Right. I can't believe it's been 2 years already. It's out of control.
Right. But it's also the birthday of Vladimir Putin.
Oh, it is?
73 years old.
Wow.
So maybe we can use that to switch over to Russia.
Okay. All right. Well, something that I've been seeing between Ukraine and Russia seems to be a pickup of attacks on energy infrastructure. It seems like on both sides. But is Russia's strategy now to kind of cripple Ukraine before the winter?
They've done that in the past, and so it does seem to be somewhat seasonal. In general, though, the strikes have increased in intensity, significantly over the last few months. The strikes that we're seeing, every other day now are 10 times what they used to be a year ago. We're hundreds and hundreds of drones, dozens of missiles, and doing terrific damage. And part of what they're striking is the energy infrastructure, but also military production sites and logistics. That's something that's actually new. They've been hitting a lot of trains recently, and I think some of these energy infrastructure strikes are actually directed at the railway system, which is reliant on electricity. These are electric powered trains that the Ukrainians use. And so that presents real problems. How do how do the Ukrainians get soldiers to the front? It's become increasingly difficult. Anywhere, what I've heard is like once you get within 25 or maybe even 40 kilometers, basically you have to get out of the cars because now there's the penetration by drones is so deep that like any moving vehicle within roughly 40 kilometers of the line of contact is just an easy target. So at that point you get off and maybe motorcycles for a short distance, but even then at some point, even that's too dangerous. You have to walk through the woods. So it's become quite difficult. And now these strikes on the train, that's a deep rear. So it's like even hundreds of kilometers back, they're presented with problems. And logistics are a big part, something that lay people tend not to focus in on. We think about the weapons and the frontline combat troops, but those frontline combat troops need that logistical support. They can't fight without it. And if your logistics are crippled, then you're in real trouble. So, a lot of these strikes, including the strikes on the energy infrastructure, are having a real impact on the battlefronts.
A lot of analysts keep on saying that we're now in the end game when it comes to Ukraine. Do you believe that's true, that we're in the end game now?
I'd like to believe it. It's just that I've heard this for a couple of years. It just always seems to take longer than we think. There are signs of growing stress, and if we look at things again from year to year, we can see how every year the Ukrainians have become weaker and the Russians have become stronger. It's not just something that we're saying. You can see it in the action, being played out on the battlefield. And again, there are 4 different cities that are under, or not necessarily cities. You could call, I think, at least Pokrovsk in Minograd a city. That's well over 100,000 right there. But 4 different important cities or towns that are under siege and are likely to fall within the next, month or two. And we've never actually been there before. It's always been like, one city or one town at a time, or major city or town. So it just shows that it is the Russian advance is, accelerating. It is growing more powerful. But it is still, I think it's fair to still call it incremental. I mean, we're not talking about, huge amounts of territory. Now, there is a point, I think, where that will happen. It's hard to say. And it may be, I would predict after all these cities and towns fall that it will happen. I think actually saw some of that in the Dnipropetrovsk region, because that is kind of an open region, an area where there isn't really much in the way of fortifications or of towns. And recently, over the last few weeks, the Russians have been advancing rather rapidly there, maybe a little bit more than incremental, a couple of kilometers on the average every day. And then I think, though, we'll see that everywhere. And then it'll increase from there. But when? Okay, I'll say sometime next year. Sometime next year, probably the Battle of the Donbass will end. But then remember, it's just that the Russians have committed themselves to taking Kherson and Zaporozhye. Now, Kherson, a good chunk of it is on the other side of the Dnieper. So that's a river crossing. That's going to be a big challenge. Again, if the Ukrainians have been weakened enough, the Russians can do it, and they will. Again, they have committed themselves to doing that. But that's still in the future. That's a lot of difficult fighting right there. And then Zaporozhye. Okay, that's a huge city. They got most of the oblast, the region of Zaporozhye, but the city of Zaporozhye is still under Ukrainian control. They are approaching it from both the south and from the east, and I think they're going to reach it next year. But we're talking about one of the largest cities that they have. I think probably will be the largest city to date that they will have to take. Again, we're talking about a major fight. Maybe at that point, the Ukrainians will be so weak that it just won't be much of a fight. But a lot of people have made those predictions in the past, and find out that there's still fight left in the Ukrainians. There still is. And I think a lot of it, again, has to do with this drone warfare that just makes advances really very, very challenging. You can create these kill zones, with you have all these different drone operators, and they're looking at these screens like over a belt of maybe a few kilometers wide. There are people just watching for every movement, and so anything that moves in that area, any of any size anyway, is immediately detected and can be wiped out. So many people have commented on the fact that there just haven't been any tanks or armored vehicles appearing for weeks now. And in the last few months, very, very few. They're vulnerable. And so what are the Russians doing? They have Putin actually discussed this at Valdai. It's just that they send 2 or 3 men at a time. In these very, very small numbers, they find they can penetrate the kill zone, get to the other side, and then another group of 2 or 3, another group of 2 or 3, and eventually you get enough people on the other side of the front, and the front collapses at that point, and you're able to take that territory. And that's what they've been doing, again with success. But you can see why that takes time. It really, this is 21st century warfare.
What's the situation now about the Tomahawk missiles? Do you think that it will actually happen? And if it does, if a Tomahawk missile gets fired into Russia, what would Russia do? What would the...
Yeah, well, there's a lot of discussion about that right now. And that came up at Valdai too. And I guess Putin gave something of a wishy-washy answer that angered quite a few people. And then I think later he gave a stronger answer. There definitely will be retaliation. And then I think I saw something today that, yeah, a firmer answer to that this will be real escalation and there will be a response, and it might not be limited to Ukraine. I believe it was Peskov that actually said that. So it is, it is something that the Russians are taking very seriously. And they pointed out, like they did with the ATACMS, that, for these missiles are operated actually, by NATO, by the Americans in particular. So it would be not just that, okay, we've sold these weapons to Ukraine, the Ukrainians can do what they want with them. But no, we're there with our guys and we're firing them into Russia, pre-2014 Russia. So that's an attack by NATO, attack by the U.S. on Russia. This is a very, very serious matter. Now, will they give those Tomahawks? It's just, there was some report a few days ago, the decision had been made not to. But then we had Trump, I just in a very kind of incoherent way. It's not clear if he had agreed to or not. He said, right, well, I can't tell you what the decision is, but we're telling them that they can't, we got to, they got to check with us or whatever before. It sounded like he just revealed that he had agreed to it. And then there was some, I saw some other report that, yeah, the decision had been made to give some amount of Tomahawks to Ukraine, but the discussion about, what the targets could be. So maybe, but then again, I don't think it's such an easy matter. What I've heard from many different sources is that to fire these Tomahawks, well, Ukraine at present does not have the means to actually launch these Tomahawks. They're fired from ships or submarines, and there's just recently from the ground. There's a Typhoon system that can be used to launch them, but the Typhoon system has just begun production. I think there are only like a couple of models, available at the couple systems available at the present time, and they're within the U.S. The idea was to send like one to Germany next year. So I really don't know if he gave the Tomahawks to Ukraine now, they wouldn't even be able to use them. So it just seems like a moot point at present.
Right. I mean, strategically, it doesn't make any sense. It's not going to change the situation on the battlefield. They're not going to be sending enough of these in any large quantity. And if they only send like one Typhoon system, like you said, then what this just does is it gives your enemy, your adversary, a chance to look at your weapon, your firepower, and analyze it. It's piecemealing things. Practice. Hey, you guys want to learn how to build a EW profile on the Tomahawk? Here's 2 Tomahawks. They're subsonic. I imagine they'll be able to shoot them down anyways. They're not particularly fast. I know they fly low, which makes it more difficult. But I imagine, Russia would, if you fire a couple of them, they'll probably have those figured out. And then you've just neutralized another very important piece of the U.S. arsenal. So strategically, militarily, it doesn't make any sense. The only thing that would make sense to me is that they want Russia to respond and strike a NATO country, because then that could be the casus belli. You said that Putin mentioned that it could not be contained to NATO for the strike, but I don't think they would ever strike a NATO country, because they know that's kind of what these European leaders want.
Yeah. Well, it's just that the Russians are on the horn of a dilemma. And that's what, I mentioned earlier, that some people are angry at Putin. They think that he should be harsher. It's a difficult situation because on the one hand, you don't react forcefully. That encourages the other side. And that's what, the hardliners within Russia and also, among Russian supporters in general point to say, hey, because you've been so rational, you've been so cool-headed, well, they keep on upping the ante. They keep on, escalating on the NATO side. And this is dangerous. And they have a point, right? But then on the other hand, it's just like you say, well, if we do, this is not good for Russia if we actually bring in all of NATO, or not good for the world either. We do want to try to avoid this, but it just, at some point you just may have to. And it's hard to say, again, I think we pointed this out. It's just like in general, Russia has been very, very reluctant to respond to provocations from the West, but eventually they will. And that's how we actually got the SMO. And I think it was a tremendous, it was a shock to a lot of people on the Western side when it happened, and on the Russian side too. But there had been warnings for a long time, and eventually it happened. And so it may be the same thing with this escalation of the missiles. It's just like, okay, yeah, hey, this is serious. We know what you're doing. We reserve the right to respond in kind and say, okay, we'll ignore the Russians. They're just bluffing. Putin's just bluffing, and then eventually, you get a big response, and there will be hysteria, of course. It's really sort of the thing for the Russians, damned if you do, damned if you don't. It's really a hard decision. I wouldn't want to be in a position to, like Putin, where I'd have to make a decision on that.
Yeah. What do you think is the best possible outcome we can hope for the Ukraine war? I think sometimes the best possible option isn't the option that people want. Just like we're talking about with Israel and Iran, unfortunately, maybe the best option is to just let Israel kind of die a slower death from its own wounds that it inflicted, instead of going out for some type of larger war and just really punishing them through that, because we know that could just so much death and destruction. And so I think we should always be operating in the lens of how can we just reduce death, casualties, the harm that's being did, for the Ukrainian people, the people in the Middle East. Like, is it a slow kind of let it just sort of peter out and die out, and just avoid escalation? And people might be mad at Putin for doing that, but the rational thing is just don't give them any excuse to escalate. Don't get anybody involved, even if you could beat them. It's just all of a sudden nukes could start
you go
flying.
right up to you go right up to the edge of World War III when that happens.
Right.
That's just a terrifying prospect. And we should try to avoid that at all costs. I agree. It's in the end, that clearly, it seems to me that is Russia's strategy, is to go slow, methodically. Okay, we're on course to win. We just continue to wage this war of attrition. They will, increasingly collapse over time. It will get those territories that we now consider to be Russian. But when they get there, they've already taken a good chunk of Kharkov and Sumy and of Dnipropetrovsk. I'm sure they're not going to give those up, absent unless if let's say the Ukrainians just woke up and finally, saw a reason and said, okay, let's make a deal. Like Arestovich, the former press aide, to Zelensky. I think he's now living in New York, but he said, really the Ukrainians, for their own sake, should make this deal with Russia right now and accept the loss of the 4 oblasts in addition to Crimea. And then and stay out of NATO. It would be the best thing for Ukraine. The killing would stop. You would preserve. Still, Ukraine would be a viable territory. You would have access to the sea, everything. You could prosper. But they're not going to do that. And in fact, Arestovich was just put on the kill list as a result. That along there with Scott Ritter and other people. So it's what's probably going to happen again is that because Ukraine will not take that good advice, Russia will take those territories they've committed to taking, and they will already have a lot of the other territories. And at that point, because Ukraine is still fighting, still sending missiles into Russia, Russia will say, okay, now, we're to take it or leave it right now. If you don't, we're going to demand more. And then we'll see Nikolaev and Odessa or all of Kharkov or maybe all of Dnipropetrovsk. So anyway, I think I have trouble believing. I know, like Mark Sloboda argues, and maybe he'll be proven right, that they're going to be forced to go all the way to the Polish border. I have trouble believing they're going to do that.
Yeah,
I think
too. I don't think so.
Yeah, they'll stop at the Dnieper, and then except for down in Kherson and the southern provinces, where they'll go all the way to Odessa and Transnistria.
Okay.
I think that's where they'll stop.
But the big question is, what happens to what's left of Ukraine? Do they stop? And if they don't,
yeah.
So
That's the thing. They keep on launching missiles, whatever. Will the Russians be forced to, put in a huge buffer zone, extend the so that those territories they take are not under constant bombardment? How will they? There's a real risk that it just will be a festering sore, and it'll never really stop. It'll maybe the battle lines will more or less freeze, but there will be kind of like what happened, let's say, during those 8 years from 2014 to 2022. The battle lines were frozen, but there were a lot of artillery shells, almost all of them actually coming from the Ukrainian side, but not all of them, for 8 years, and thousands of casualties. Is that the way it's going to be? I think there's a real chance. It's not a full-fledged war, but it's a simmering conflict that just doesn't go away and could blow up into a war again.
Do you think there is potentially a political solution here? I saw an RT headline saying that Kiev is preparing elections. Did you see anything about that?
I actually didn't. I would be surprised.
They said secretly preparing elections. And I think it's. I just skimmed the article, but from what I gathered, it's Zelensky almost feels like he needs this to kind of solidify his position. So he's, he thinks he can actually win it, from what I gather, by just suppressing all other opposition, and then just have basically a rigged election, and then say like, look, because I'm democratically elected, or fight for democracy again. That get that whole thing going.
Oh, that's possible. Again, he's gone ahead and suppressed all the opposition parties, and now he's suppressing, people even within his, his Maidan movement, all rivals to him. And then with very little, some criticism from the West, but not much. Putin's a dictator somehow. Zelensky is a democratically elected, president in a democracy, which is just beyond nonsense and has long been untrue. But the thing is, he could probably get away with it because because the Western media will cover for him. They'll probably declare it some great victory for democracy.
Right. Do you see any signs of escalation otherwhere? Because we mentioned Transnistria once, that this could potentially be another one. And I want to know if you have any thoughts about this, because you know how I check Chinese social media pretty regularly for the expat edit. So if anybody's on WeChat, search the expat edit and you can read the articles I put out daily. But Chinese, Zuhu on Chinese social media, one thing that was trending the other day was they were talking about a resurgence of the war in Serbia with Kosovo, saying that I guess Vucek's made some comment about, potentially there's some unrest here, some problems. Do you know? Have you heard anything about that? I mean, it was something the Chinese were chattering about on the. So I was like, maybe there's something here that Chinese analysts might think, or Chinese netizens are thinking this.
Right. Well, all I know, I haven't heard anything recently. I know it's been a long source of tension. Between Serbia and Kosovo have been at odds, and there's always been the chance for open conflict. Of course, there is a Serbian minority, within Kosovo, in the north of Kosovo, and they have been persecuted by the Kosovars. But I haven't heard anything recently. Again, it kind of makes sense that the Chinese would pay attention to it, because China does have close relations with Serbia. Serbia's worked hard to, strengthen their relationship with China.
Okay, interesting. Well, what about Venezuela? Any other place that, what's going
Yeah.
on? Do,
Well,
I Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah. The only thing I heard is that I guess recently, maybe it was yesterday, that Trump declared that after they blew up yet another boat, that they've blown up all the boats, and now the evil narco terrorists aren't no longer risking the trip across the sea, but now there are land targets, which suggests that the next strike will be somewhere within Venezuela proper. And that could be, part of a general operation, a decapitation operation. Who knows? We'll see. Or it could be more limited than that. But yeah, those ships are still there. There's still a lot of war talk, and I expect something will happen.
So
Again, maybe they're just hoping that I'm sure they have their assets on the ground within Venezuela, and they're hoping they can do something, like they can actually carry out a coup with their proxies, within the territory of Venezuela.
Why are we doing this exactly? What is it, because of oil? What's or is it because sometimes I have this idea that Trump almost wants to create a fire here in Latin America so that way he has an excuse to get out of his fires in the Middle East and with Russia. But sorry, we got war with Venezuela, I can't help you. And then could that be it? I just don't understand where this is coming from.
It's well known that that's something that political leaders will do, that they find these wars, especially against weak opponents, to be very popular and a very easy way to distract the population from other problems. That's certainly a possibility. Well, there's always been this obsession. You can say it's sort of an extension of the Monroe Doctrine. There's something that not just Trump but all previous presidents saying, this is our backyard. The Caribbean and all the states bordering the Caribbean. Basically we have a say in what kind of government are installed there. And we do not like to have leftist governments, Marxist governments. And so there has been this just obsession with Venezuela as being sort of a potential another Cuba. And that's particularly true of Marco Rubio. I've heard that he's behind a lot of this. But then there is the oil. Venezuela has the largest, apparently, proven oil reserves in the world. So we're talking about a huge amount of oil. Now, there's just no reason why, again, if we just worked with them peacefully, it could be very beneficial to both sides. Here you are in our hemisphere. We can help you invest in your facilities and agree to some sort of, but like the Chinese, we would kind of limit this to a commercial venture and not try to gain control of your politics, but we can buy the oil from you, and that would be good for you and it'd be good for us. This is something that we could do, but it seems to be hard for us to think that way. We really want control, especially, within our so-called backyard.
So part of it is just that the U.S. just doesn't like any leftist Marxist governments, and this is just sort of just follow through from the Cold War, where we just that was the idea. The domino theory still somehow persists in the halls of D.C.
Right. Well, no, it's very true. I mean, we had when I remember when I was young under Reagan, there was Grenada. That was a Marxist coup on a very small island in the Reagan sent the soldiers in, the Marines, and again, it was a tiny island, so it only in a day or two the Americans succeeded, seized control of the island and arrested the coup leaders, because again there was a Marxist coup, and it wasn't an entirely unreasonable operation from the perspective of the U.S. But we don't need to get into the details of that. But then there was also Nicaragua, and there was a real obsession with Nicaragua. That was the leftist government that came to power, with strong Marxist leanings. And there was just this hatred. And we ended up, creating and funding this guerrilla army to go after them, the Contras, and just from year after year, eventually it led to that Iran-Contra scandal, which I think is really beyond our scope here. It's a huge, messy, complicated affair. But it was a result of this obsession, again, this belief that we cannot tolerate, any kind of, openly leftist, Marxist-leaning government in this hemisphere, especially close to our own shores.
Is it
So
because
this is not new in that sense. You know, we've seen that Cuba. You know, again, Cuba is still under this economic blockade or the sanctions. Nicaragua and Grenada. You know, that didn't last very long. But now Venezuela. You know, the obsession with Venezuela began before Trump. It's been, you know, this need to, you know, or this intolerance for leftist government there goes back to previous administrations, both Democratic and Republican.
I just find it odd that would be the reason. I mean, for me, it's almost like, well, if socialism, leftist, Marxist governments are so horrible, then they will fail on their own. And then you have a perfect example to show people like that was supposed to be like the moral of the story of the collapse of the Soviet Union is like, see, the system doesn't work. It'll eventually collapse. And that's why it's not good. You know, so we have this living example. So, you know, why would that's feel like what you should be doing, right? Just like, okay, yeah, you just work on your own system and people will be able to see like, yeah, this system's better than that system. But if you have one that's just.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the original, you know, idea of America is that we were supposed not to become entangled in these foreign affairs, not to go seek monsters to slay, but to be the shining city on the hill, you know, just to be an example. And that America is at its best was that. But obviously we've strayed from that, I think, very laudable idea, you know, many, many times over the decades and even the centuries. I think it would just be very much in our own interest. There's no reason why we can't deal with Venezuela. You know, obviously, like this oil trade is mutually beneficial, and you say you don't like the government there. Well, again, it's a matter for the people there, and over time, you know, if they see something isn't working. You know, and they see an example of other governments where it seemed to have a better system. I think that just naturally, you know, whether the better systems will win out. You know, you just have to be patient. You don't have to go in and kill people. The thing is, if you go in and kill people, you often strengthen the hardliners, the defenders of the system. You know, imagine yourself as a Venezuelan. You're an opposite. You think like these policies are just stupid. I wish we had a different president. Maduro's, you know, just a dumbass and whatever, et cetera. But then, you know, the Americans start attacking you and say, "Hey, sign me up. I'm fighting. You know, this is my land. This is, you know, I'm joining the militia and fighting in Maduro's army because." And I'm sure that's what's going to happen. That's what happens again and again in all these places.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
I mean, even me, I know nothing about Venezuelan politics or Venezuela, but just when I see the U.S. sending our Navy down there and we're blowing up the speedboats, I'm all of a sudden becoming sympathetic to Maduro. And I don't know really anything about the guy because it's this, you know, just stuff you told me. But it just makes me feel like I'm on the side of Venezuela now, just from this action, even though I don't even understand what's happening there, you know?
Right.
It's just madness. I just can't believe why we can't figure that out. It's just so obvious that what we need to do is just mind our own damn business. Just get out of everywhere. I just don't understand why it's so difficult to enact.
Well, yeah, it's completely, and it also is on a, you know, there's obviously just a cooked up pretext here. You know, the thing about the drug chain, the narco. If you're really concerned about that, you know, you go somewhere else. Should be Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, Mexico. You know, it's not Venezuela. It's the whole thing is just thoroughly contrived and for anybody who knows anything, it's just obvious that we're lying. We're just looking for a pretext for war.
Yeah. And we all we do is we try to look for scapegoats. I mean, with the drug problem, it's a massive problem here, but we got to look at ourselves. This is a deep sickness and rot that needs to be addressed.
Social problem.
Right. That it's, we can't be just saying that this is the fault of China or you know, some drug cartels or whatever. There's something wrong with people that are having to turn to these drugs constantly because they're not getting anything fulfilling in their lives here in America. It's sad. Okay, well, I think we can end it there, Dad.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure when we'll do the next episode, so apologies. My schedule this week is a bit crazy, but next week things will be back to normal. But we'll try to do one in the next few days, maybe a shorter one, Dad, if that works for you.
Okay.
Okay, thanks a bunch. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you when I talk to you.
All right.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.